The first sentence on the cover told me what department it came from. The second told me why no one wanted to admit it ever existed. Department Reflex-12, the folder announced, in the usual stamped type, no different from 100 other behavioral labs. But someone had gone back later, on a different machine, cropped the margin to make space, and added a line that did not belong on any official document. KGB wanted to trigger emotion with one sound. It sat there, crooked and stubborn, like a half-erased confession. It was not the kind of phrase committees used. Committees spoke of stimulus optimization and mass behavioral alignment, not of wanting something as simple and vulgar as a lever for human feeling. If you spend enough time in these archives, you learn that it is not the heavy stamps that make a file dangerous. It is the sentences that sound too honest. According to the short summary clipped to the inside cover, a Soviet-era lab once tested a faint acoustic pattern believed to influence instinctive responses. During one of the restricted trials, technicians detected a fading signal forming an anomaly within the chamber. Moments later, an unusual reaction surfaced in the monitored graphs, followed by a strange shift that the observing KGB unit chose not to comment on. That was the summary. It felt less like an introduction and more like a warning. I turned the page anyway. The origin of Reflex-12 is buried in a paragraph that looks, at first glance, like bureaucratic filler. A provincial factory, a minor accident, a disciplinary incident that should have been handled locally. The file rewinds to a winter demonstration at that factory, years before the department was founded. There had been a safety drill, the kind no one takes seriously until something goes wrong. A siren mounted above the yard, a crowd of workers in damp coats, a loudspeaker distorting its way through instructions. Nothing unusual, except that afterward, several people went to the infirmary complaining of nausea, trembling, unsteady hands. Not from the cold, from something they could not name. One woman said she had felt suddenly ashamed standing under the siren, though no one had singled her out. Another said he had wanted to drop to his knees and cover his head, even though there was no blast, no fire, only the sound drilling into the sky. The factory's in-house paramedic made a note that their pulse rates had spiked at the same moment, independent of individual fear. He wrote, almost apologetically, that the siren's tone seemed to cut through the body in a way that resembles a reflex more than a reaction. The note should have ended up in a drawer and died there. But someone from a district committee was present for the drill, and district committees had their own pipelines to different kinds of readers. Within a few months, that note had found its way to a working group on emergency signaling and population behavior, where a colonel with a long memory underlined one phrase and wrote, in the margin, "Study resonance?" From there, Reflex-12 grew, in the way such things always do. Not from a grand plan, but from a cluster of people who all believed, for their own reasons, that there might be something worth exploiting in the way sound slides under the door of the rational mind. The lab they were given was small, a concrete chamber in the lower level of a research institute nominally devoted to acoustics and communications. Officially, Reflex-12's goal was to develop more efficient alarm and public address systems, tones that would cut through industrial noise, messages that would not be ignored in a crisis. Unofficially, the goal was simpler and uglier. The KGB wanted to know if there was a single sound that could trigger a specific emotion in a population without their consent. Fear, of course, was the first candidate. Fear is useful. Fear makes people move, when they would rather stand and think. But fear is imprecise. It can scatter as easily as it can herd. What the early notes of Reflex-12 circle around in increasingly contorted language is something more refined. A sound that would make people yield. Call it obedience if you like. Call it sudden vulnerability. A tone that would slip past arguments and memories and land directly on whatever part of a person's nervous system governs the decision to resist. The first experiments were indirect. They gathered volunteers, students, conscripts, hospital patients with too much time and not enough choice, and exposed them to sequences of tones in a controlled chamber. They measured pulse, sweat, micro movements of muscle. They mixed in harmless control sounds, white noise, music, ordinary beeps. Mixed among them, buried just above or below the edge of comfortable hearing, they introduced more complex patterns. Chords shaved of their musical context, scraped down remnants of factory sirens. A fragment of recorded crying stretched and smoothed until it no longer sounded like a voice, but retained some of its contour. They were looking for anything that produced a reaction that did not match the conscious explanation. A frown with no stated annoyance. A clench of the hand when the subject reported feeling fine. A tiny dilation of the pupils when nothing in the content seemed threatening. In the early reports, these moments are numbers. Later, when the technicians start writing in the margins, they turn into impressions. There is one sequence, a technician notes, that does not make subjects flinch or cover their ears. It makes them smaller. They slump, their shoulders drop, their eyes lower. It looks like the posture of someone being scolded, even though no words are spoken. Another writes, after his third week of night shifts, when pattern 12 is played, the room feels as if someone disapproving has walked in, even when no one has. Pattern 12, the designation that would eventually lend its number to the department, was not a simple tone. According to the surviving diagrams, it was a faint acoustic pattern composed of several frequencies layered in a way that should, in theory, blur into nothing. Yet, when it was played at low volume in the chamber, many people reacted as if they had heard their own name, spoken by someone they owed something to. The official tests on pattern 12 remained cautious at first. Short bursts, long rest periods. Subjects carefully prepared, instructed that they were part of an experiment on alarm efficiency. The staff still believed, or pretended to believe, that the worst they might accomplish was a particularly irritating siren. Then the committee took a closer look at the graphs. The technicians who worked these studies rarely thought of their equipment as anything but a means to an end. Wires, ink, humming boxes that translated flesh into lines. But in Reflex-12, the graphs started to behave in ways that disturbed even those who had built them. When pattern 12 was played, the monitored signals did not merely spike and settle. They seemed to anticipate the sound, rising just before the sequence began, as if the body had learned something it could not unlearn. This happened only in subjects who had been exposed to the pattern several times before. First-timers might startle or shift. Repeated subjects showed a different curve, a small, doleful dip before the tone, like someone closing their eyes in advance of a known reprimand. The KGB observer attached to the project, his name rendered only in initials, wrote that this preemptive reaction may represent a conditioned submission response related directly to pattern 12. His words are careful. His underlining is not. It is here that Reflex-12 crosses a line that most of the people in the building would have preferred to leave theoretically intact. Instead of asking, "Can this pattern make people more likely to follow instructions in a crisis?" their questions shifted to, "Can this pattern make people more likely to agree with authority in general?" The internal experiments pivoted. For one series, conscripts were brought in and told they were participating in a test of reaction speed. They were asked to perform a simple, boring task: press a button when a light flashed, while, in the background, different sounds cycled through the speakers. At certain intervals, pattern 12 was played, barely audible. Immediately afterward, they were given a choice: repeat the task for another 20 minutes, or sign that they had completed enough and could return to the barracks. The results, at least as presented in the file, are ambiguous but suggestive. Subjects exposed to pattern 12 were more likely to continue without arguing, to sign whatever was placed in front of them. Those who had never heard it before complained more, negotiated, asked questions. The report phrases it in drier terms. In presence of pattern 12, resistance to unpleasant but framed as necessary tasks showed measurable decrease. The word that recurs in the technician's margins is not measurable. It is shame. Subjects act, one notes, as if they would be letting someone down by refusing, though that someone is not physically present. At this point, Reflex-12 had remained only an exercise in manipulation. The file would be ugly but unsurprising. Sound has always been a weapon in one form or another. Slogans, anthems, shouted orders. This was just a more precise blade. What twists the project into something stranger is the night the pattern behaved as if it did not need human ears at all. The file calls it Restricted Trial 7B, as if that label still matters. The description is scattered across partial logs, cross-referenced memos, and one shaken testimony that appears to have been added later, in a different kind of ink. The idea for the trial, according to a planning note, came from a problem the staff had been worrying over quietly. If pattern 12's effect depended on repeated exposures, what happened in the room between those exposures? Did the chamber itself, the equipment and air and concrete, play any role in how the pattern worked on bodies? It is not a rational question. Rooms are not tape. Air does not have memory. But enough technicians had remarked, in their unofficial notes, that the chamber feels heavier after a long series, that someone gave in to the impulse to test the emptiness. The plan was simple. Clear the room, remove every subject, connect the usual monitoring apparatus but not to a human. Instead, attach the sensors to a neutral load, a baseline device designed to register only external noise and equipment drift. Then play pattern 12 at various intensities and see if any measurable trace remained after the sound had stopped. The assumption was that nothing would happen. The chamber, after all, was just concrete and metal. The fading signal anomaly described in the summary should not have been possible. They chose a night when the building was as empty as possible. Late, cold, a weak wind scraping at the vents. 2 technicians on duty, 1 KGB observer sitting back with his habitual unreadable stare. They ran baseline tests first. Silence, ordinary tones, recorded speech. The monitors behaved as expected, registering only the faint rustle of the equipment itself. Then they cued pattern 12. Even on the page, I can feel the room change. The first playback was uneventful. The pattern washed through the speakers, a faint, almost hollow sound, like a breath drawn in through teeth and held. The monitors quivered, then settled. The technicians noted nothing unusual. They waited. They played it again. According to the logs, it was on the third playback that the anomaly began. Residual trace detected in chamber sensors after termination of pattern 12. One entry reads, amplitude very low but non-random. Decay time increased with each repetition. The neutral load was not supposed to show anything beyond mechanical hum. Yet, when they stopped the sound and watched the line, it refused to flatten entirely. A faint echo of the pattern remained, too weak to hear, inside the walls of the graph. One of the technicians, who must have been too tired for caution, wrote bluntly in the margin, "The room is still hearing it." They repeated the sequence, varying duration and volume. Each time, the pattern bled a little further into the bass line. Between plays in the silence, the line drifted, then curled back toward a shape that looked disturbingly like the edge of pattern 12's contour. The anomaly itself would have been puzzling but containable if it had stayed confined to ink and phosphor. It did not. About an hour into the trial, as they prepared for another round, one technician felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. He later described it as the exact feeling I used to get as a child when my father called me into a room where I knew I had done something wrong. He said nothing. His job was to watch gauges, not his own insides, but his hands slowed, his shoulders slumped. The KGB observer watched him for a moment, then asked quietly whether he was ill. At that same moment, though no human stood in it, the chamber sensors registered a brief surge, a knot in the empty line, as if something in the room had reacted. They played pattern 12 again. The technician's chest tightened further. He described afterward a desire to apologize, though he could not say to whom. It was then that the second technician noticed that he felt it too. Not pain, not panic. A flattening of energy. A sudden impulse to make himself smaller, quieter, less visible. No one had addressed them. There were no shouted orders. The only thing that had changed was that they had filled an empty concrete box with a sound designed to evoke submission, and then left it looping faintly in its own aftermath. The KGB observer ordered a pause. It is to his credit that he did not immediately decide this subjective discomfort was the effect they had been seeking all along. For a moment, the men in that room understood that something was happening to them that was not purely a matter of choice. They cut the sound. The spikers went dead. The line on the monitor did not. What happened next is described from 3 angles. The first angle is the equipment log. The line, after a brief, wavering dip when the speakers went silent, climbed back up, slowly, as if on its own, and settled into a low, tremoring plateau. It was not identical to pattern 12, but it was not baseline either. It was as if the room had learned the gesture of the tone, and was now doing a poor impression of it without being asked. The second angle is the technician's recollections. Both men reported that, in the first few seconds after the sound stopped, they felt a thin wash of relief, like the air in a room after a scolding voice has finished. Then, just as they were about to relax, the heaviness returned, upstream of any actual noise, accompanied by a distinct impression that they had failed to complete a task. The feeling, one said later, that you have turned something off too soon, and now it is waiting for you to correct your mistake. The third angle is the KGB observer's reaction. He did not report physical sensations. In his account, he remained a neutral witness, but his notes change at that point. The clipped, impatient handwriting becomes smaller, more controlled, as if he were trying not to leave fingerprints in the narrative. During post-playback interval, he writes, operators displayed affect consistent with unprompted guilt. Sensors indicated continuation of patterned activity in absence of active stimulus. Interpretation uncertain. Recommend immediate cessation of chamber trials pending review. It is a cautious recommendation. It is not an admission that something in an empty room seemed to be reproaching them. When they resumed routine experiments with human subjects, the pattern became harder to frame as a simple cause and effect tool. Subjects who had never been in the chamber before, but entered it after that night, showed signs of a reaction even before pattern 12 was formally played. They sat down, wired up, nodded impatiently through instructions. Then, as they waited for the first tone, they shifted in their seats, straightened collars, avoided looking at the observation window. One described the pre-sound emptiness as the quiet in a classroom just before the teacher walks in. Another said, "It feels like we're already in trouble." The technicians changed nothing in their procedure. They checked the speakers, the wiring, the grounding. They rotated subjects. The room's atmosphere remained. One day, an engineer with no direct connection to the project was asked to inspect the chamber after a minor ventilation fault. He spent an hour up on a ladder, adjusting a grill, his back to the floor. When he climbed down without having seen any of the equipment or spoken to the staff about their work, he remarked half-jokingly, "Whatever you're testing in there, it reminds me of my headmaster's office." The staff laughed dutifully. No one volunteered an explanation. From there, Reflex-12 drifted into a gray area between behavior study and something that had no name. The KGB, paradoxically, became more cautious as the evidence of peculiar effects increased. In one memo, a superior in the committee writes, "In response to Sokolov's request for wider trials, while the prospect of an acoustic trigger for compliance remains theoretically attractive, the current pattern appears to produce unstructured emotional responses in operators themselves. Unstructured is not useful. Not useful, not tightly correlated enough with commands, slogans, orders. A sound that made everyone in the room suddenly remember every teacher, parent, officer, and disappointed face they had ever known might be potent, but it was not a precision instrument." Still, they were reluctant to abandon years of work. The internal experiments took a more desperate turn. If pattern 12 could not be sharpened into an obedience whip, perhaps it could be diluted into a more subtle nudge. They tested variations on the pattern, softened edges, inverted contours, different frequency bands, mixed backgrounds. They tried to isolate the element that provoked the preemptive slump in the shoulders. Was it the low hum, suggesting a large throat clearing? The sudden narrow band that resembled the start of a word? The slight asymmetrical rise in volume that mimicked the intake of breath before rebuke? They built dozens of variants. None produced exactly the same effect. Some made people simply irritated. Others left them unmoved. A few caused headaches that lingered for days. One, accidentally, induced a brief fit of hollow laughter in 3 subjects who insisted, afterward, that nothing about the sound had been funny. The technicians grew cautious around the speaker system, treating it with the wary respect usually reserved for high voltage. They moved more quietly in the chamber, as if afraid to disturb something they could not see. Then came the incident that ends the experimental phase of the file. It is described not as a catastrophe, but as a distortion event. The language alone suggests how much the authors disliked talking about it. The setup was straightforward. A small group of experienced subjects, habituated to the lab, seated in the chamber. Pattern 12, in its original form, was to be played at low volume while they answered a series of neutral questions. The idea was to see whether the sound could be layered invisibly into conversation without drawing conscious attention. Halfway through the session, the technician in charge reported a familiar feeling: the chest heaviness, the desire to apologize to no one in particular. He tried to ignore it. The recorder captured the following exchange. "Please state your name." "Why?" "It's part of the protocol." A pause, then the subject unexpectedly says, "You already know it. Don't make me say it again." "Why not?" "Because I feel like I'm being called to the front of the class." It should have been another data point. Pattern 12 makes grown men sound like children summoned by a teacher. But then, according to the log, the room itself changed. The microphones registered a sound that none of the staff heard with their own ears, a faint, additional tone layered under Pattern 12, slightly out of phase. On paper, it shows up as a second set of teeth under the primary waveform. Too subtle to notice in real time, obvious in retrospect. Simultaneously, all three subjects in the chamber stopped speaking. Their eyes shifted, not toward the speaker on the wall or the observation window, but slightly downward and to the side, as if they had heard someone standing just inside the door. For several seconds, nothing moved. The technician said nothing. The KGB observer scribbled something illegible on his pad. Then, all three subjects, in perfect unison, exhaled. It was a soft sound, not dramatic. The sound people make when a scolding stops and a verdict is about to be delivered. The monitors for heart rate, skin conductance, and muscle tension all showed the same curve. A sharp spike, then a drop, not into calm, but into a kind of resigned flatness. One subject afterward said, "It was as if the sound had finally made up its mind about me." Another said, "I suddenly felt that whatever this is has been listening longer than I have, and it has already decided I am guilty of something." The technician, struggling not to project his own unease onto the data, noted an unusual alignment of operator and subject effect during distortion event. The phrase he wanted to use but did not was, "We all felt judged." Afterward, they played back the recordings at low speed, trying to isolate the extra tone. They could not. It was gone. The tapes, as far as they could tell, contained only the original Pattern 12 they had always used. The anomaly, it seems, had been real, only in the moment. A shimmer in the air that left impressions in bodies and instruments but declined to be a clear trace on paper. The KGB observer did not officially comment on the graphs. The file notes this pointedly. No additional interpretation was offered by committee representative. In a place where every minor deviation is usually met with a demand for explanations, that silence reads louder than any directive. Within weeks, the project was temporarily suspended pending review. The review never reappeared in the file. The cover-up that followed was hasty, improvised, not a purge, not a dramatic sealing of doors, just a gradual starvation of the department. Equipment was reassigned to more mundane studies. Staff were told their expertise would be more valuable in departments concerned with industrial noise reduction. The chamber was left empty for longer stretches. Pattern 12 was formally decommissioned. The official reason in the closing recommendation is revealing in its vagueness. Given the current inability to isolate specific, controllable emotional responses linked solely to Pattern 12, and considering the undesirable influence on operators, further work on this specific sequence is not advised. Future research into acoustic modulation of behavior should emphasize clarity, reproducibility, and reduced impact on staff. Reduced impact on staff. As if the worst sin of Reflex-12 was not what it might have done to subjects, but what it had begun to do to the people running it. And yet, as with all these projects, traces leaked out. In one annex labeled Informal Observations Unverified, a series of small incidents are listed without comment. A guard on night duty near the lab who reported, in his private notebook, that sometimes when he walked past the closed chamber door he felt the impulse to straighten his back and lower his voice, even though no one was there. A cleaning woman who refused to mop the floor in the empty room, because, as she told a colleague, it sounds like someone is about to sigh in there the whole time. A junior engineer who, during a routine test of a completely different sound system in another part of the building, abruptly stopped, turned off the speaker and said, "No, not that one," though the tone he had generated did not match pattern 12 in any simple way. When asked why, he could only say, "It feels like being told to sit down and listen, and I don't want to." The file's compiler did not try to fit these anecdotes into a theory. He simply gathered them like filings around a magnet, labeled them, and pushed the annex toward the back of the folder. There is, however, one more layer. What happened to the material record of pattern 12 itself? According to inventory lists, all test tapes and generators associated with Reflex-12 were ordered destroyed. Several were duly signed out, degaussed, their casings reused. The documentation is neat, too neat. In the back pocket of the folder, there is an unsigned note clearly not meant for official eyes. Of 12 primary source reels, it reads, only 11 accounted for in destruction log. Remaining unit not located. Possibilities, mislabeling, relocation to committee archive, unauthorized retention. Recommend quiet check. There is no follow-up. That missing reel should not mean anything decades later. Even if it survived physically, any device designed to play it in its intended configuration has long since been scrapped. Sounds do not retain power in the absence of context. They become hiss, noise, artifacts. And yet, the more I turned the pages of Reflex-12, the more I found myself hearing, in the silence between the sentences, something that was not quite silence. A shape of expectation, as if the file itself were bracing for a tone it both feared and missed. It would be easy to dismiss that as occupational contamination. You read enough about people feeling guilty in empty rooms, you start making the rooms around you carry the same weight. So, I did what I usually do when a file begins to overwrite its own reader. I went to see the place. The building that once housed Department Reflex-12 still stands, though its name has changed, and its facade now bears a more optimistic logo. It is a center for communications technology on paper, a place where people develop software, compression algorithms, glossy things that live in the networking sections of stores rather than in basements. The receptionist had never heard of Reflex-12. She knew, vaguely, that there were old labs downstairs that no one used anymore because the acoustics are strange. She said that last part with a smile, half amused, half repeating a story she did not fully believe. An elderly maintenance worker overheard my questions and, after a brief argument with his own caution, agreed to show me down. The third level below ground felt like every third level below ground. slightly colder, slightly damp, air smelling of old paint and slow dust. The corridor leading to the former chamber had been repurposed as storage for broken office chairs and obsolete routers. The chamber door still had its heavy frame. The official warning sign was gone, replaced by a smaller handwritten note taped at eye level. Do not store equipment inside, echo problem. The worker gestured at it, embarrassed. People say their heads hurt if they sit in there too long, he said. It's nonsense, of course, but we keep it empty to make them feel better. He unlocked the door and stood aside. The room was bare. No speakers, no wires, just a square of old mounting bolts on one wall where the array must have hung, and a faint outline on the floor where a console had once sat. The air should have been no different from the corridors. It was. I will not dramatize it. There was no sudden drop in temperature, no whisper, no unseen hand closing the door. But there was a quality to the silence that made my shoulders hunch without consulting me. You know the feeling in certain offices or classrooms when you walk in after being summoned and find the adult already seated, waiting. The way you instinctively stand a little straighter, glance at chairs as if unsure you have the right to use them. The chamber felt like that. I stayed by the door at first, telling myself I was only respecting the light from the corridor. Then I forced myself to walk to the center of the room, to turn in a slow circle, to stand where the subjects must have stood or sat. There was no audible sound, no hum, nothing my ears could latch onto. And yet, as I stood there, I became acutely aware of my own posture. My hands wanted to be visible, empty. My gaze wanted to lower. I felt, idiotic as it sounds, like someone was about to speak my name, and I would have to answer with both syllables clearly, like a child in front of a register. The sensation passed when I stepped back into the corridor. It did not vanish entirely. It clung, like the memory of a rebuke, into the elevator and back into the day. A rational mind has no trouble with this. I knew what the room had been used for. I had read hundreds of pages about Pattern 12, about submission and judgments and the posture of the scolded. Of course, I carried that with me. Of course, I projected it onto the concrete. Still, on some level below the rationale, the empty chamber felt less empty than it should have. Back in the archive, I searched for names from the Reflex-12 staff list. Some were gone, their traces ending in tidy obituaries. One, a technician who had signed many of the night shift logs, was still listed at an address across town. He opened the door reluctantly, his gaze doing the quick scan of identification that people who used to work with secrets never entirely unlearn. When I mentioned the department number, he flinched, then recovered into a kind of weary humor. I hoped that one would stay asleep, he said. We talked at his small kitchen table, the window open to let in the distant roar of traffic. Modern sound, layered and directionless. His hands wrapped around his mug as if it were an anchor. At the time, he said, it all seemed very logical. They tell you, we are studying alarms. We are studying how to get people out of buildings faster. No one says, we are going to spend years trying to find the sound that makes the spine give up. Did you find it? I asked. He thought about this longer than I expected. We found something, he said. Whether it was the sound we made, or something we woke up in ourselves, I am not sure. He described the early work in terms that matched the file. Then he spoke about the restricted trial with the empty chamber, the heaviness in his chest as Pattern 12 echoed off bare concrete. At first, we joked that we had scolded the room, and now it was sulking, he said. Later, it stopped being funny. The feeling you get when the sound stops and you are grateful. And then a second later, without any speaker, you feel that attention again. That was worse than any graph. Attention from what? I asked. He shook his head. From nowhere, he said. From the shape we had made in ourselves by listening, again and again, for the tone. Do you understand? It was as if our bodies had become better receivers than the machines. Once your nerves have learned that a certain kind of silence means you are about to be judged, any silence shaped like that will do. So, it was all conditioning, I said, hearing the skepticism in my own voice. He smiled thinly. If that helps you sleep, keep it, he said. All I can tell you is that I've not tolerated certain sounds since then. Not the drill used in the courtyard, not the whine of the old refrigerator, not a child practicing the same note on a flute. It is not that they hurt my ears. They make me feel like I am back in that room, waiting for someone to tell me I have failed. Did you ever hear pattern 12 again after the lab closed? I asked. Not exactly, he said. But sometimes when a train breaks badly, or a siren misfires, or the pipes in my building sing in winter, I catch a flavor of it, like recognizing a handwriting in a different sentence. At the door, as I left, he added one more remark, almost in spite of himself. They thought they wanted a sound that would make people obey, he said. The irony is that they made a sound that made even the people in charge feel small. That is why they buried it. No one in power wants a lever that does not distinguish between the hand that pulls it and the people on the other end. The last page of the Reflex-12 file looks, at first, like a routine closure. It contains the standard phrases, project terminated, resources reallocated, further work not recommended. Then, squeezed into the bottom margin in a different typeface, there is a short addendum. Note: during final equipment decommissioning, residual acoustic imprint detected in chamber response even with all sources disconnected. Although amplitude was negligible and below conscious hearing, technicians reported uncomfortable atmosphere and unaccountable feeling of having disappointed someone while present in the space. No further tests authorized. There is no stamp under that sentence, no signature. It reads like something someone insisted on putting in at the last minute, no matter how little it was going to change. Somewhere, perhaps, a missing reel sits on a forgotten shelf. Its tape brittle, its label half-peeled. If you pressed play, the machine would probably cough and die. Pattern 12 would remain a pattern only in ink and old muscles. What lingers is not the sound itself, but the idea that there might be a single tone capable of slipping under everything we use to defend ourselves. The KGB wanted to trigger emotion with one sound. What they got, briefly and uncomfortably, was a sound that made them feel the weight of their own intentions. I cannot tell you whether Reflex-12 succeeded in any technical sense. There is no evidence of cities brought to heel by a whispered frequency. No reports of entire crowds dropping their arguments at the same note. There are only small, stubborn impressions. A room that feels like a reprimand without explanation. A man who cannot bear certain kinds of mechanical whine. A handful of technicians who, decades later, still straighten their backs when a specific silence falls. In the archive, when I close the folder and the reading room returns to its ordinary hush, I sometimes notice in the first second after the cover meets the table, a brief tightening in my chest. It could be nothing. It could be long hours, bad posture, the residue of reading about other people's attempts to hack the human hinge between sound and feeling. Or it could be the faintest echo of something those men in that basement once taught their nervous systems to expect. That after certain patterns, written, heard, or imagined, comes judgment. When I leave for the night, the building is quiet. The city outside hums at its usual pitch. The lights along the corridor buzz softly. I nod to the guard, sign my name, step into the cold. Halfway down the steps, I always become aware of my own footsteps on the stone, the steady, dull rhythm echoing between the walls. It is just sound, just weight and distance and gravity. It should mean nothing. Yet part of me, small and unreasonable, listens to those echoing steps and wonders, not whether anyone is following me, but whether anything in the old concrete is listening for a pattern it recognizes, and what, if anything, it would want from me if it did.